Imagine a life where every sunrise brought not hope, but the chilling certainty of another day spent selling your body. For Els von Eystett, a young woman born into the brutal poverty of 15th century Nuremberg, this was no nightmare. It was her inescapable reality. What if I told you that in just minutes, you'll journey into the darkest corners of medieval Europe, far beyond the gilded castles and noble courts, to witness a woman's fight for survival against unimaginable odds? They called them women of the street, but Els was more than a label. She was a survivor. From the stench-filled alleys to the crowded brothels, her existence was a daily gamble with disease, violence, and despair. Yet, amidst this filth and degradation, a flicker of defiance burned within her. Every night, as the city lights dimmed, Els faced a world that saw her as property, a commodity to be bought and sold. Then came the night she met Klaus. He was not a client, but a shadow from her past, a man who offered a glimmer of escape, a life beyond the brothel's walls. Everything she had been told about her fate was about to be shattered. This wasn't a love story. It was a desperate pact, a dangerous alliance forged in the crucible of desperation. Just when a fragile hope began to bloom, a brutal confrontation with the formidable madam of the brothel, a woman known only as the Butcher, threatened to extinguish it forever. The Butcher's words echoed like a death knell. "You belong to me, girl. Always." This wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. What Els did next, a choice born of raw courage and the will to break free, changed everything. She was about to gamble her life, not for love, but for the one thing she truly craved: freedom. What unimaginable price would she pay for that desperate leap into the unknown? The year was 1475, and in the shadowed alleys of Regensburg, a city clinging to the Danube, Els von Eystett knew only the biting chill of hunger and the gnawing ache of despair. Her world was a tapestry woven with threadbare hopes and the grim reality of her birthright. Born to a laundress and an absent father, Els had learned early that survival was a brutal dance, one where grace mattered less than grit. Her days were a monotonous cycle of scrubbing soiled linens, her hands raw and chapped, the meager coin she earned barely enough to keep the wolf from the door of their cramped, shared room. Every morning, the scent of stale ale and human waste clung to the cobblestones as Els made her way to the river, the weight of the laundry basket a familiar burden on her slight frame. She watched the merchants, their silks rustling, their laughter echoing from the grand houses, a stark contrast to her own existence. A quiet fury simmered beneath her placid exterior, a resentment for the arbitrary hand of fate that had dealt her such a meager lot. This simmering anger, however, was a luxury she couldn't afford. Survival demanded a clear head. One particularly harsh winter, the river, froze solid, halting the flow of her meager income. Hunger became a constant, gnawing companion, not just for Els, but for her ailing mother, whose cough grew steadily worse. The city's charity was a cruel jest, offering only meager scraps and colder stares. Desperation, a cold, unyielding hand, began to tighten its grip around Els's throat. She saw the other women, those who walked the shadowed lanes after dusk, their faces painted, their laughter brittle. She had always averted her gaze, her mother's warnings echoing in her ears like a somber hymn. But now the choice was stark. Watch her mother waste away, or step into the very darkness she had always shunned. The decision, when it finally came, was less a choice and more a surrender to the inevitable. One evening, as the last sliver of sun dipped below the city walls, casting long, skeletal shadows, Els found herself standing at the entrance to the notorious Red Lantern district. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was the precipice, the point of no return. Her old life, meager as it was about to be irrevocably severed. The chill of the evening air did little to cool the fire in Els's veins. Each step towards the Red Lantern district felt like a betrayal. a surrender of the last vestiges of her innocence. The district pulsed with a different kind of life, one she had only observed from a distance, shrouded in judgment. Lanterns indeed cast a lurid glow, painting the faces of women in garish shades of red and gold. Their laughter, once brittle in her memory, now seemed hollow, echoing the hollowness growing inside her. A stout woman with a face like a worn leather purse, her eyes surprisingly kind, emerged from a doorway. "Lost little bird?" she asked, her voice a low rumble. This was Frau Helga, the madam, a name whispered with both fear and grudging respect among the laundresses. Els, her throat tight, could only nod. Helga's gaze, sharp and assessing, swept over Els's threadbare but clean dress, her youth, her raw vulnerability. A flicker of something unreadable crossed the madam's face. Perhaps pity, perhaps calculation. Helga beckoned her inside, into a world thick with the scent of cheap perfume, stale wine, and desperation. The common room was a cacophony of drunken boasts and forced gaiety. Els's eyes, accustomed to the muted colors of poverty, struggled with the overwhelming spectacle. She saw women, some older, some barely older than herself, their smiles fixed, their eyes distant. A wave of nausea washed over her. This was not merely a choice. It was an abyss. Helga led her to a small, cramped room upstairs. "You'll start here," she stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "Learn the ways. Earn your keep." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Els swallowed, her gaze falling upon a rough cot in the corner. This was it. No grand pronouncements, no dramatic turning point, just the cold, hard reality of a new existence. The sheer mundanity of the transition was a cruel twist, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil that had brought her there. It was less a fall from grace and more a quiet, agonizing slide into the inevitable. Her first night was a blur of unfamiliar faces, forced smiles, and the constant gnawing fear of the unknown. She learned quickly that survival in this new world required a different kind of strength, one that hardened the heart and numbed the spirit. Els found herself observing, adapting, a silent student in the harsh academy of the streets. She learned to distinguish between the truly cruel and the merely desperate, between empty promises and fleeting kindness. The world outside, the one she had left behind, already felt like a distant, faded dream. The world outside, the one she had left behind, already felt like a distant, faded dream. Els quickly learned that the true currency here was not coin, but knowledge. The whispers of the docks, the illicit trade routes, the shifting loyalties of the city guard. She watched, absorbed, and began to understand the intricate dance of survival played out in the shadows. Her initial encounters were clumsy, marked by fear and a raw vulnerability she struggled to conceal. But each harsh lesson, each bitter humiliation, chipped away at her naivete, replacing it with a steely resolve. One frigid morning, a gruff, scarred woman named Greta, a veteran of these streets, unexpectedly took Els under her wing. Greta offered no kindness, only blunt instruction on how to navigate the city's underbelly, how to spot a false promise, how to haggle for a better price for her fleeting company. Greta's methods were brutal, often involving a sharp cuff or a cutting remark, yet Els recognized the strange form of protection it offered. This mentorship, however, came with an unspoken price. Greta expected loyalty, absolute and unwavering. A few weeks later, a wealthy merchant from Nuremberg, known for his cruelty, became a frequent patron. He offered exorbitant sums, but his demands were degrading, pushing Els to the very edge of her endurance. She endured his touch, his cruel laughter, her mind retreating to a distant, safe place. One night, he grew particularly violent, his eyes alight with a terrifying malice. Els, remembering Greta's gruff advice about self-preservation, saw a heavy pewter tankard within reach. In a blur of desperation, she swung, the metal connecting with a sickening thud against his temple. He slumped, unconscious. Panic seized her, a cold, paralyzing dread. This was not the plan. This was far beyond the boundaries of her grim existence. She had merely intended to survive, not to commit an act that could lead to the gallows. The room, once a place of forced intimacy, now felt like a tomb. Els stared at the inert form, her breath catching in her throat. The silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic pounding of her own heart. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The chill that seeped into Els's bones had nothing to do with the winter air. It was the cold dread of discovery. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The inert form on the floor was a testament to a desperate act, a grim monument to her shattered innocence. Panic clawed at her throat, a primal instinct screaming for escape. She couldn't leave him there, not like this. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, to twist into accusing shapes. Her mind, usually so sharp, raced in a dizzying spiral, the weight of the world, of her mother's failing health, of her own terrible choice, pressed down on her. A sudden, sharp rap at the door shattered the suffocating silence. Els froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Could it be? Had someone seen? The knocking came again, louder, more insistent. Her breath hitched. This was it, the inevitable consequence she had always feared. With trembling hands, Els fumbled for the latch, her eyes darting to the body on the floor. There was no time to hide it. The door creaked open, revealing not an angry mob or the city guard, but a lone figure, cloaked and hooded, their face obscured by the deep shadows. A wave of false hope, cold and fleeting, washed over her. Perhaps this was a chance, an unexpected reprieve. Els? A low voice whispered, barely audible. The figure stepped into the room, and the lamplight caught a familiar glint of a silver pendant. It was Marta, one of the older women from the shadowed lanes, her face etched with concern. Marta, who had always offered a kind word, a shared crust of bread, never judging, but her eyes, as they fell upon the scene, widened in horror. The gasp that escaped Marta's lips was a fragile sound, yet it echoed like a thunderclap in the small room. "By the saints! Els, what have you done?" Marta's voice, usually so steady, trembled with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusation, shattering the last vestiges of Els's fragile composure. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusation, shattering the last vestiges of Els's fragile composure. Her gaze, wild and desperate, darted from Marta's horrified face to the still, pale form on the straw-filled cot. A choked sob escaped her lips, not of regret, but of a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. "What else was there to do, Marta?" she whispered, her voice raw, barely audible. She was suffering. Every breath was a torment. Marta recoiled, her hand flying to her mouth. "But this is not the way." Her eyes, usually so full of weary compassion, now held a chilling blend of fear and judgment. The bond that had tethered them, two solitary figures navigating the city's harsh underbelly, began to fray, stretched taut by the grim tableau before them. Els felt the shift, the sudden, terrifying chasm opening between them. She had expected understanding, or at least a shared burden of their miserable existence. But instead, she found only condemnation. A harsh cough racked Els's frame, a dry, rasping sound that echoed the very illness that had consumed her mother. She clutched her side, the familiar ache a cruel reminder of her own precarious health. "You don't understand," she rasped, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "You never saw her truly suffer, Marta. You never heard her pleas for release." The words were a shield, deflecting the blame, yet they rang hollow even to her own ears. Just then, a heavy knock rattled the door, startling both women. Marta's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror. "The watch," she mouthed, her face paling further. Elsa's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of impending doom. They had been seen, somehow. The whispers of the alleyways, those invisible threads of gossip, had found their mark. The door splintered inward with a brutal kick, revealing two burly figures in the livery of the city guard. Their eyes, cold and unyielding, swept the squalid room, landing first on the lifeless form of Elsa's mother, then on the two trembling women. One guard, his face grim, pointed a thick finger at Els. "There she is, the one they call the Angel of Mercy." The ironic title, whispered by those who had witnessed her desperate acts of charity in the past, now twisted into a grotesque accusation. Els felt a cold dread seep into her bones. Her desperate act, born of a twisted love and an unbearable helplessness, had finally caught up to her. The jailer's grip on Elsa's arm was like iron, pulling her through the cold, echoing corridors of the Regensburg prison. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of her impending doom. She had expected a trial, perhaps even a chance to explain her desperate actions, but the justice of the city was swift and unforgiving for those like her. Instead, she was led directly to a small, windowless room where a single, stern-faced magistrate sat hunched over a ledger. He did not look up as she was brought in, merely dipped his quill in ink and scrawled a few more lines. "Els von Eystett," he finally intoned, his voice devoid of emotion, "you are charged with the theft of bread and coin, and with the violation of public order." He paused, his gaze finally rising to meet hers, cold and unwavering. "Your acts of charity, as some have called them, were nothing more than a thinly veiled excuse for larceny. The city cannot tolerate such blatant disregard for its laws, especially from one of your profession." A wave of despair washed over Els. There would be no mercy, no understanding. Her desperate act, born of a twisted love and an unbearable helplessness, had finally caught up to her. She thought of her mother, now gone, of the fleeting moments of warmth she had tried to bring to others. Was it all for nothing? Just as the magistrate prepared to deliver her sentence, the heavy wooden door creaked open. A cloaked figure, their face obscured by shadow, stepped into the room. The magistrate frowned. "This is a private matter." The figure moved closer, and as they did, a glint of silver caught the dim light. It was the same merchant Els had once tried to help, the one whose goods she had borrowed to feed the starving. He held a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a child's toy. "Your Honor," the merchant's voice was surprisingly soft, "I wish to withdraw my complaint against this woman, Els." The magistrate's eyes widened in disbelief. "Withdraw? After such an egregious offense?" The merchant placed the wooden bird on the table, its small eyes seeming to stare up at them. "This was my daughter's. Els found it for her after it was lost. She asked for nothing in return." He paused, his voice gaining strength. Her methods may have been unorthodox, but her heart was in the right place. She helped those the city had forgotten. A flicker of something akin to hope ignited within Els. The magistrate, clearly flustered, looked from the merchant to Els, then back to the wooden bird. The law was clear, but the merchant's unexpected intervention had thrown a wrench into the rigid machinery of justice. After a long, tense silence, he sighed, pushing the ledger away. "Very well. Given the unusual circumstances and the plaintiff's withdrawal, I will commute your sentence, Els von Eystett. You are to be banished from the city of Regensburg, effective immediately." Banishment. It was not freedom, not truly, but it was life. Els, though weary, felt a new quiet strength bloom within her. She had survived. She would carry the scars of Regensburg, but she would also carry the lessons learned, the unexpected kindnesses, and the fierce, enduring will to live. As the city gates closed behind her, Els looked towards the open road, a new, uncertain chapter stretching before her, a chance to forge a different path in a world that had once seemed to offer her none. The chill of the gallows wind was a familiar companion now, not the terror it once inspired. Els, her body ravaged but her spirit unbroken, looked out at the assembled crowd. They were the same faces that had once condemned her, now silent, their judgment replaced by a morbid curiosity. The central conflict, the relentless pursuit of survival in a world that offered only scorn and exploitation, had finally reached its grim, inevitable end. She had faced down the city's most depraved, outsmarted the cunningest of rivals, and endured unimaginable suffering. Each scar, each tremor in her voice, told a story of a life lived on the razor's edge. The young, naive girl who had first stepped into the shadows of Eystett was long gone, replaced by a woman forged in the fires of adversity. Her journey had been a brutal education, teaching her the true cost of dignity and the fleeting nature of freedom. A sudden commotion rippled through the onlookers. A cloaked figure, her face obscured, pushed through to the front. It was Agnes, her former confidant, the one who had betrayed her to the authorities. For a fleeting moment, Els's eyes met hers. There was no anger, no accusation, only a profound weariness. Agnes's face contorted, a silent confession of guilt and a plea for forgiveness that would never be answered. The hangman approached, his shadow falling over her. There was no last plea, no tearful confession. Els had made her peace with her choices, her battles, and her fate. She had fought for every breath, every scrap of autonomy, in a world that sought to deny her both. The consequences of her life, lived outside the bounds of societal acceptance, were now upon her. Yet in that final stark moment there was a quiet triumph. She had not merely existed. She had lived on her own terms to the very end. The rope tightened, and the silence descended, heavy and absolute, leaving behind only the echoes of a life fiercely lived.